The Hawthorne mansion glittered with the brilliance of crystal chandeliers on a cool spring evening where the delicate clink of champagne glasses mingled with the refined laughter of the elite. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of calculated whispers. James Hawthorne, the master of this lavish affair, stood at the heart of the sprawling room, his jet-black hair impeccably styled, his piercing eyes scanning the crowd like a king surveying his subjects. Dressed in a meticulously tailored dark suit, he radiated an undeniable aura of power. To James, these gatherings weren't just a chance to flaunt his immense wealth. They were a stage, a platform to prove that money could unlock every door in existence. The crowd orbiting James was a familiar cast of the rich and powerful, businessmen, politicians, and heirs basking in the glow of their parents' legacies. They smiled, toasted, but their eyes betrayed a constant wariness, as if they were all players in an invisible chess game. James reveled in it, the admiration, the respect, and above all, the control. He took a sip of red wine from his crystal glass, savoring the faint bitterness on his tongue, when a sharp voice sliced through the room. Ethan Caldwell, James's college friend turned provocateur, approached with a smirk that carried a dare. Tall and lean, with mischievous green eyes that sparkled under the lights, Ethan wore a light grey suit that seemed deliberately chosen to stand out. In his hand, he twirled a glass of white wine like it was a weapon. "James," he said, his voice low yet laced with challenge, "you're always going on about how money can buy anything. How nothing in this world is beyond your reach. But talk's cheap, isn't it? Especially when you're surrounded by a bunch of sycophants." The chatter around them faded, curious eyes turning toward the two men. James raised an eyebrow, unshaken on the surface, though a flicker of irritation stirred within him. Ethan was always like this, poking at people's pride, especially James's. He set his glass down on a nearby ebony table, crossing his arms with a cool, confident edge. "Money is power, Ethan. Are you denying the obvious? With enough of it, I can turn anyone, anything, into the best version of itself." Ethan tilted his head, feigning contemplation, before flashing a sly grin. "Is that so? Prove it then, James. I bet you wouldn't dare step out of this glamorous little bubble and do something truly different." His soft chuckle drew intrigued glances from nearby guests. "I'll wager $5 million that you can't marry someone completely out of your league. Not beautiful by your standards, not from this crowd, and live with her for 3 months. And here's the kicker. You've got to convince the world it's real. Make her a part of this precious society you're so proud of." The room grew heavy with tension. Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves on a still lake. James let out a short, dry laugh, the sound grating from his throat. "Are you joking, Ethan? Me? Marry someone outside my world? It sounds like some cheap TV drama you stumbled across." But Ethan's gaze didn't waver, cold and daring, cutting straight into James's pride. Ethan shrugged, stepping closer, his voice dropping, but still audible to all. "If you back out, I get it. After all, you're just James Hawthorne in name, right? All talk, no action." The word stabbed like a dagger into James's chest. He knew Ethan's game. This wasn't just a bet. It was an assault on his honor in front of everyone watching. To refuse would be to admit weakness, something James would never allow. His lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing to mask the anger simmering in his chest. "You want to play hardball, Ethan," James said, his voice dropping to a growl like a cornered beast ready to strike. "Fine. 3 months, $5 million. I'll show you there's nothing I can't do." Ethan laughed heartily, extending a hand for a firm handshake, a declaration of war sealed. "I'm looking forward to it," Ethan said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "But make it real. I want to see her by your side at big events, dripping in designer gowns, with no one suspecting a thing. Fail, and your wallet's going to feel a lot lighter. James nodded, but a thread of unease wormed its way into his mind. He wasn't afraid of losing money. 5 million was pocket change to his fortune, but the idea of tying himself to a stranger, someone alien to his world, gnawed at him. The crowd buzzed back to life, their gossip humming like a swarm of bees. James grabbed his glass, downing a large gulp to drown the feeling. He'd win this. He always won. Just then, Ethan's gaze swept the room, landing on a shadowed corner near the entrance. There, Emily Carter, James's new housemaid, moved quietly with a tray of drinks in hand. She wore a simple black and white uniform, her brown hair tied back in a neat, low bun, her bare face revealing faint freckles. Emily wasn't striking, wasn't glamorous, and certainly wasn't the type James ever noticed. She kept her head down, gliding through the room like she wanted to melt into the shadows. Ethan's smirk widened as he pointed at her. "There she is," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Your maid. Perfect, isn't it? No one would ever suspect James Hawthorne would marry someone like her. This challenge just got a lot more interesting." James turned, his eyes locking onto Emily, and in that moment his blood ran cold. A maid? The idea was absurd, almost insulting. He frowned, spinning back to Ethan. "You've lost your mind. Marry her? A servant?" "Too scared to try," Ethan shot back, his words an arrow aimed at James's ego. "If money can do anything like you claim, this should be a breeze, right? Or are you so afraid of losing to me that you won't even take the chance?" The crowd hushed again, waiting for James's response. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into him, vultures circling for a slip-up. His grip tightened on the glass, nails digging into his palm. He couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of everyone. Taking a deep breath, he forced a chilling smile. "Fine," he said, his voice steady as steel. 3 months with her. I'll make you eat your words, Ethan. Get your checkbook ready." Ethan burst into laughter, clapping like he'd just watched a stellar performance. "Fantastic. I'll be watching every step. Don't let me down, James." As Ethan turned away, blending back into the crowd, James stood rooted, his gaze fixed on Emily. She continued her work, oblivious to the fact that she'd just become the centerpiece of a game she never signed up for. Inside James, a storm brewed. This wasn't just about beating Ethan anymore. It was about proving that nothing and no one was beyond his control. But deep in his mind, a faint voice whispered, "Have you gone too far this time?" The Hawthorne mansion buzzed with music and whispers long after James accepted Ethan's daring challenge. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering reflections across gilded walls, but the atmosphere had shifted, thick with tension, curiosity, and anticipation. James stood there, his wineglass now cold in his hand, his sharp gaze sweeping the room like a predator sizing up its next prey. He knew Ethan wouldn't let this game end quietly. And sure enough, moments later, Ethan turned back, his smile as sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Don't keep me waiting too long, James," Ethan said, his voice smooth yet dripping with mockery. He twirled his glass of white wine, his eyes darting through the crowd as if searching for something, or rather, someone. "Since you've agreed, I'll pick your opponent right now. You're always boasting about controlling everything, aren't you? Well, let's make this game a little more entertaining." James's lips twitched into a smirk, masking the unease creeping into his chest. Ethan had a knack for turning every situation into a high-stakes drama, and this was no exception. Ethan paused, his gaze locking onto a dim corner of the room. There, amid the swirl of guests in extravagant gowns and tailored suits, Emily Carter moved like a shadow. She wore the plain uniform of a housemaid, black blouse, white apron, her light brown hair pulled into a neat low bun that revealed the pale curve of her neck, and a few stray strands falling messily free. In her hands, she carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, balancing it carefully as she wove through the crowd. Emily's face bore no trace of makeup, her calm brown eyes cast downward as if she were trying to vanish into the opulent chaos around her. She wasn't beautiful in the way James or his circle defined it, not regal, not seductive, but there was something about her that held the eye. A simplicity, almost a purity. Ethan pointed at her, his smile stretching into a dangerous curve. "Her," he declared, his tone brimming with delight. "Emily, your new maid. Isn't she perfect? Someone no one would ever suspect, someone who doesn't belong in our world. If you can turn her into Mrs. Hawthorne in everyone's eyes, I'll believe your money really can do anything." His crisp, mocking laugh rang out, drawing curious glances from nearby guests. James turned, his eyes landing on Emily, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to freeze. His brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a tight line. A maid? The idea wasn't just absurd, it bordered on an insult to his pride. He pictured himself beside the stunning women who graced his parties, polished to shine under flashing cameras and versed in the art of calculated conversation. And then there was Emily, a sparrow lost among swans. "You're kidding, Ethan," James said, his voice dropping low, edged with disdain. "Marry her? A servant? Do you take me for a fool?" Ethan shrugged, stepping closer, his eyes glinting with provocation. "What's the matter, James? Too scared to try?" He shot back, his words sharp as an arrow. "If you truly believe money can change everything, here's your chance to prove it. Or are you afraid you'll fail in front of us all, afraid even James Hawthorne has limits?" Ethan's taunt was a spark igniting the powder keg of James's temper. He felt the weight of the crowd's stares, vultures waiting for a misstep to tear him apart. Backing down now would mean admitting defeat, something he'd never allow. James's grip tightened on his glass, nails digging into his palm until faint red marks bloomed. He drew a deep breath, wrestling the anger surging in his chest. "You want to play dirty," he said, his voice firm as an oath. "Fine. I'll marry her. 3 months and I'll have you begging for forgiveness for doubting me." Ethan burst into laughter, clapping as if he'd just witnessed a masterful performance. "Brilliant, he exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "But make it real, James. I want her by your side, draped in designer dresses, gracing major events. If you fail, that 5 million is mine." As Ethan turned away, blending back into the throng, James remained rooted, his gaze fixed on Emily. She continued her quiet work, unaware that her life had just been swept into a high-stakes gamble she hadn't chosen. She glided past a group of guests, her tray trembling slightly as someone brushed against her. She dipped her head in a soft apology, her voice a faint breeze, then resumed her duties. James watched her, his unease morphing into something more complex, curiosity laced with contempt. She was too ordinary, too unremarkable to fit into his plan. Yet that very ordinariness made the challenge tantalizing. If he could mold Emily into someone the elite world accepted, no one would dare question his power again. Later that night, as the party wound down, James stood alone on the mansion's balcony, staring into the dark expanse of the garden below. The music had faded, but Ethan's words still echoed in his mind. He took a final sip of wine, the bitterness sliding down his throat. He wasn't afraid of losing money. 5 million was nothing to him, but the thought of binding himself to someone like Emily stirred a rare unease. She didn't belong in his world, didn't play by the rules he'd lived by for years. Then a cold smile curved his lips. If this was the challenge, he'd win. He always did. Meanwhile, Emily stood in the mansion's vast kitchen, the dim light casting soft shadows on her hands as she carefully washed each glass. The steady trickle of water was the only sound breaking the silence. She hadn't heard the whispers about her from the grand room beyond, had no idea her life was about to be swept into a whirlwind she couldn't control. For Emily, this job was survival. a way to send money to her two younger brothers living with their aunt in a distant town. She didn't dream of dazzling lights or extravagant gowns, she just wanted peace. But fate doesn't consult people like Emily. As she looked up, wiping her hands on her worn white apron, she didn't know James's eyes were on her from afar, a hunter preparing to set his trap. In that moment, two utterly different worlds collided, one of arrogance and power, the other of quiet simplicity. And neither James nor Emily could have guessed that this encounter would change them both forever. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight slipped through the heavy curtains of the Hawthorne mansion, casting a pale glow across the polished wooden floors. The vast house carried a deceptive stillness, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. James Hawthorne stood in his study, hands buried deep in the pockets of his trousers, his steely gaze fixed on the garden outside. Last night, he'd agreed to Ethan's bet, a decision that now, in the sober light of day, felt like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. But James wasn't the kind of man to back out of a promise, especially when his pride was on the line. On the other side of the mansion, in the sprawling kitchen with its white marble walls, Emily Carter scrubbed a towering stack of dishes. Her slender hands moved rhythmically, fingers reddened by the cold water. Her black and white uniform was frayed at the seams, but she paid it no mind. The steady rush of water from the faucet was the only sound in the quiet space, blending with the soft cadence of her breathing. To Emily, this was just another ordinary workday, a means to send money back to her two younger brothers living with their aunt in a far-off town. She didn't dream of luxury. She only hoped to keep her small, fragile family from falling apart. Then came the sound of footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Emily paused, turning her head, and her heart stuttered when she saw James standing in the doorway. He wore a simple white shirt, but the way he carried himself, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, exuded an unmistakable air of authority. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and scrutinizing, as if appraising an item before a purchase. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, her voice soft but tinged with unease. "Mr. Hawthorne, do you need something?" James stepped closer, the polished leather of his shoes clicking against the stone floor. He didn't answer immediately, just stood there a few feet away, his gaze never leaving her face. At last, he spoke, his voice low and steady, like he was negotiating a business deal. "Emily, I need to talk to you about a proposition." He lingered on the word proposition, giving it an odd weight that made Emily frown, her hands instinctively clutching the edge of her apron. "What proposition?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. James leaned forward, resting one hand on the kitchen counter, his eyes now glinting with something akin to curiosity. "I want you to marry me," he said, his tone as casual as if he'd asked her to brew a cup of coffee. The dish in Emily's hands slipped, crashing into the sink with a loud clatter, water splashing onto her apron. She spun to face him, eyes wide with shock. "What?" she gasped, her voice breaking. James didn't flinch, his expression as cold as ever. "You heard me. A marriage, but not a real one. Just a contract, 3 months. In return, I'll pay you enough to change your life." Emily let out a laugh, but it was a dry, bewildered sound. "Are you joking, Mr. Hawthorne? This isn't funny." She took a step back, as if distance could shield her from this bizarre offer. But James didn't smile. He pulled a pre-written check from his pocket, placing it on the counter with a slow, deliberate motion. The number scrawled across it, a string of zeros too long to count in a blink, made Emily's breath catch in her throat. "I'm not joking," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of persuasion. "You're struggling, aren't you? With this money you could start over. No debts, no worries, all you have to do is say yes." Emily stared at the check, then back at James. In his eyes, she saw no warmth, no affection, only the icy detachment of a man used to controlling everything. To him, she wasn't a person, but a tool, a means to some end she couldn't fathom. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, searching for a reason to refuse. James shrugged, his reply brutally honest. "Because you're perfect for this. No one would expect me to marry someone like you. That's exactly why it'll work." His words hit her like a slap. She wanted to turn away, to shout that she wasn't a thing to be bought and sold. But then the faces of her brothers flashed in her mind, their thin cheeks, their sad eyes when she'd left home to work far away. The piling bills, the sleepless nights of worry. They weighed on her like an invisible boulder. If she said no, she'd stay trapped in that endless cycle. But if she said yes, she'd be trading something far more precious than money, herself. James watched her, noting the conflict swirling in her deep brown eyes. He tilted his head, softening his tone slightly, as if to ease the tension. "After 3 months, we divorce. No questions, no strings. You go back to your life, I go back to mine. But you'll have a fresh start, a better one than you've got now." Emily drew a shaky breath, her trembling hands setting the last dish on the rack. She turned to him, her gaze no longer frantic but filled with a pained resolve. "I'll do it," she said, her voice small but steady. "But I'm doing this for my family, not for you." James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, not one of joy, but of satisfaction, like a man who'd just won a hand of cards. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, you'll be my wife." He turned and walked away, leaving Emily alone in the cold kitchen. She watched his retreating figure, her heart sinking like lead. She knew she'd just stepped into a dangerous game, but for the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked within her, hope that her life, and her brother's, might change. What it would cost her, though, she couldn't yet imagine. As James left the kitchen, he climbed the wooden staircase to his study. He shut the door behind him, leaning against it, and for the first time that day, he let out a long breath. He wasn't sure how he felt about this. Beating Ethan was all he craved, but the thought of tying himself to Emily, a complete stranger, someone who didn't belong in his world, unsettled him. He shook his head, brushing the feeling aside. This was just a transaction, he told himself. A simple contract. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that things wouldn't be as straightforward as he believed. The day after the sham marriage was sealed, the Hawthorne mansion awoke to an unfamiliar energy. The towering walls, once cold and silent, now buzzed with hurried footsteps and unfamiliar voices. Early sunlight filtered through thick silk curtains, painting the glossy wooden floors with faint, dreamlike streaks, as if the house itself were preparing for a grand performance. James Hawthorne stood on the second-floor balcony, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his icy gaze surveying the scene below. He'd won the first round of his bet with Ethan. Emily was now Mrs. Hawthorne on paper, but he knew the game was far from over. To crush Ethan, he had to transform her into someone the elite world would accept without question. Meanwhile, Emily lingered in a shadowed corner of the first-floor hallway, her hands gripping the frayed edge of her old apron, a relic she still wore despite no longer needing it. Just hours ago, she'd signed the marriage certificate in a sterile little office, flanked by 2 stern-faced lawyers and James, who hadn't even glanced her way as he scrawled his name. Now, she felt as though she'd crossed a threshold with no way back. The doorbell's sharp chime snapped her from her spiraling thoughts. As the front door swung open, a woman strode in, tall and lean, with golden hair swept into a high ponytail, dressed in a perfectly tailored grey suit. Behind her trailed 2 assistants, hauling a rack of dazzling gowns and boxes brimming with glittering jewelry. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne," the woman said, her voice crisp as the click of her heels on the stone floor. "I'm Sophia Bennett, James's stylist. We've got a lot to do today." Emily froze, her deep brown eyes widening in shock. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" she echoed, her voice so soft it nearly drowned beneath the assistant's murmurs. Sophia flashed a smile, professional, devoid of warmth. "That's right. You're James Hawthorne's wife now, and we need to make sure you look the part. Follow me." Before Emily could protest, she was whisked up the stairs, through long corridors lined with oil paintings, and into a vast room she'd never seen before. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a massive bed draped in white silk, and a wardrobe larger than her childhood home. Sophia pointed to a velvet chair in the center. "Sit," she commanded, and Emily obeyed reluctantly, feeling like a puppet on invisible strings. For the next few hours, Emily was swept into a whirlwind of transformation she couldn't control. Sophia and her assistants swarmed her, measuring every inch of her frame, draping her in extravagant gowns as if she were a living mannequin. Silks whispered against her skin, gemstones sparkled under the light, and strange high heels slipped onto her feet, each piece stunning enough to steal her breath. But with every garment they layered on, Emily felt herself slipping further away from who she was. She stared into the mirror, seeing a stranger with intricately waved hair, red lipstick, and an emerald green dress hugging her body. "Beautiful," Sophia remarked, her tone detached like she was critiquing a sculpture. "But it still needs work." Emily didn't reply. She just gazed at her reflection, her hands unconsciously clutching the dress's hem. She didn't feel beautiful, she felt like a fraud. "Do I really have to do this?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with defiance. Sophia paused, fixing her with a sharp look. "You're James Hawthorne's wife," she said, as if that answered everything. "This isn't about what you want. It's about what he wants, and I suggest you make the most of it." Emily pressed her lips together, itching to argue, but she knew Sophia was right. This was part of the deal. The price she'd pay for the money that could save her family. She took a deep breath, nodding reluctantly. "Fine," she murmured. "Let's get it over with." Sophia smirked, pleased with her compliance, and the work resumed. When it was done, Emily emerged from the room, teetering slightly in her heels. She was no longer the simple housemaid, at least not on the outside. James waited in the main hall, lounging in a leather armchair, his eyes glued to a tablet. The sound of Emily's heels clicking down the stairs made him look up, and for a fleeting moment his gaze faltered. There she stood, shimmering in the emerald gown, her hair cascading like ocean waves, her brown eyes now striking beneath subtle makeup. She didn't resemble the women he usually knew, not regal or seductive in the conventional sense, but something about her made him linger. "Not bad," he said, his tone flat, like he was appraising a new purchase. "You're starting to look like you belong in my world." Emily crossed her arms, a spark of defiance flashing in her eyes. "Thanks, I guess," she replied, her voice laced with sarcasm James hadn't expected. He raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by her bite. He was used to obedience from those around him, but Emily clearly wasn't here to make his life easy. "We've got a party tonight," he said, standing and adjusting his tie. "Get ready, I don't want any mistakes." Emily nodded, but inside a storm of emotions churned. Night fell, draping the city in a velvet shroud speckled with the twinkling lights of towering skyscrapers. Le Cygne, an opulent restaurant renowned among the elite, glowed like a jewel in the urban heart. Its glass walls reflected the shimmer of crystal chandeliers, while enormous imported flower arrangements adorned each table with meticulous elegance. The lilting strains of a violin floated through the air, mingling with refined laughter and the hum of calculated conversations. This was the perfect stage for someone like James Hawthorne, a place to flaunt his power and solidify his dominance. But tonight, he wasn't alone. Emily Carter stepped out of the sleek black limousine, her high heels meeting the pavement with a soft, unfamiliar click. The emerald gown shimmered as it clung to her frame, her brown hair cascading in gentle waves, her lips painted a bold red that stood out against her once unadorned face. She looked like someone else, no longer the quiet housemaid in a threadbare apron. But inside, a tempest of emotions raged. James stood beside her, his tailored black suit accentuating his tall, imposing figure. He extended a hand, his gaze cold but deliberate. "Let's go," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of an unchallengeable command. Emily took a steadying breath, placing her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm starkly at odds with the chill in his eyes. As the restaurant doors swung open, every head turned. Eyes locked onto them, whispers rippling through the room like waves across a still pond. Emily felt each stare like pinpricks against her skin, curious, probing, sometimes scornful. She straightened her spine, forcing herself to walk steadily in the heels she'd never mastered. But a small voice inside screamed, "I don't belong here." James, by contrast, moved with effortless confidence, as if the crowd's attention were mere breezes brushing past him, unworthy of notice. They were ushered to a table near the center, where Ethan Caldwell already lounged, a mocking smirk curling his lips. Beside him sat two of James's acquaintances, Charles, a middle-aged businessman with silver-streaked hair, and Vanessa Belmont, a statuesque woman with golden hair and piercing blue eyes as cold as ice. Vanessa was the most formidable of the trio, not just beautiful, but armed with a natural arrogance that made others wary. As Emily took her seat, Vanessa flicked her a glance, her red lips curving into a smile that was both alluring and dismissive. "So this is the famous Mrs. Hawthorne," Ethan drawled, his voice smooth but laced with mockery. He raised his glass of red wine, his eyes glinting with amusement. "I've got to say, James, I'm impressed. You've pulled off something no one saw coming." Emily's cheeks burned, but she stayed silent, her hands clutching the hem of her dress beneath the table. James shot Ethan a look, his eyes sharp as a blade. "You haven't seen anything yet, Ethan," he replied, his tone even but carrying an unspoken warning. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, the sound like silver bells, beautiful but devoid of warmth. "Really? I thought you only went for more fitting choices, James." Her words sliced into Emily's pride like a dagger. She lifted her head, meeting Vanessa's gaze, and for a moment she felt smaller than ever. But then a spark ignited within her. She hadn't come here to be humiliated. "And you think you're qualified to judge who's more fitting, Ms. Belmont?" Emily said, her voice quiet but steady, bringing the table to a stunned halt. Vanessa's brows arched, clearly unprepared for the retort. Ethan chuckled, nearly choking on his wine, while Charles coughed to mask a grin. James turned to Emily, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, though he didn't intervene. Vanessa tilted her head, her blue eyes narrowing like a cat sizing up its prey. "You've got nerve," she said, her tone syrupy but loaded with intent. "But nerve alone won't get you far here, Mrs. Hawthorne." Emily offered a faint smile, unshaken. "Thanks for the advice. I'll keep it in mind, but I don't think I need to try pleasing people like you." Her response made Vanessa stiffen, her red lips pressing into a tight line, while Ethan clapped lightly, reveling in the drama. "She's not half bad, James," he said, his eyes twinkling with glee. "Maybe you've picked the right player for this game after all." James didn't reply, but he couldn't deny Emily had caught him off guard. She didn't just endure the barbs, she fired back and sharply. He sipped his wine, masking the strange feeling stirring in his chest. The dinner rolled on with shallow small talk, but Emily felt every eye dissecting her. Every gesture, every word she uttered was magnified, as if she was some exotic creature on display in a glass cage. She fought to maintain her composure, but beneath it, waves of doubt and fear crashed relentlessly. "Can I do this? Can I survive this world?" As the evening drew to a close, Emily stepped outside, the crisp night air flooding her lungs like a cleansing antidote. She breathed deeply, relief washing over her as she escaped the scrutiny. James followed, hands in his pockets, his gaze lingering on her slender silhouette. "You did well," he said, his voice carrying a rare hint of acknowledgement. Emily turned, surprise flashing in her eyes. "Thanks, I guess," she replied, her familiar sarcasm creeping in. James's lips twitched, a rare fleeting smile crossing his face. "You don't have to like it, but you got through it. That's what matters." Emily didn't answer immediately. She studied him, searching for something in those frigid eyes, but all she found was the invisible wall he kept around himself. "I'm not here to please anyone," she said at last, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm doing this for my family, not for you or your friends." James nodded, as if her words didn't surprise him. "Good," he said. "As long as you don't embarrass me, I don't care why you're here." They climbed into the car, and Emily gazed out the window, the city lights streaking by like blurred stars. She felt she'd survived a trial, but the cost was a piece of herself being chiseled away to fit James's world. She clenched her fists, vowing not to let them erase who she truly was. Yet deep down, she knew this battle wasn't just with the prying eyes out there. It was with herself, with the fear that she might lose something more valuable than money. James, seated beside her, stared ahead, his expression pensive. He couldn't deny Emily was stronger than he'd assumed. She wasn't just a pawn in his game, she was a contender, whether he liked it or not. And that stirred an odd unease in him, a sense that this game might be slipping beyond his control. The Hawthorne mansion settled into a rare, quiet evening, the gentle breeze rustling through the garden's lush leaves. Golden light from wall sconces spilled across the oil paintings lining the corridors, casting ethereal streaks that seemed to whisper tales of the family's storied past. James Hawthorne sat in his study, his eyes fixed on a stack of documents atop the ebony desk. But his mind wandered elsewhere. Since that night at the Grand Lumiere, the image of Emily Carter standing up to Vanessa Belmont with unexpected resolve replayed in his head. She was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. Meanwhile, Emily sat alone in the garden behind the mansion, beneath the sprawling shade of an ancient oak. Her hands cradled a small, worn leather notebook, her thin fingers tracing its yellowed pages. The faint moonlight illuminated her face, highlighting the deep, melancholic brown of her eyes. She wore an old sweater instead of the lavish gowns Sophia forced upon her, as if clinging to a fragment of her former self amid the whirlwind of change she'd been swept into. The notebook was her sole treasure from her old life, a sanctuary of memories she dared not face but couldn't let go. The soft crunch of footsteps on the stone path shattered her solitude. Emily flinched, hastily snapping the notebook shut, but it was too late. James emerged from the shadows, his piercing gaze locking onto her. He wore a white shirt untucked, sleeves rolled up, more relaxed than usual, yet still exuding unmistakable authority. "It's late," he said, his deep voice cutting through the stillness. "Can't sleep?" Emily looked up, clutching the notebook tighter, as if shielding it from his scrutiny. "I could ask you the same," she replied, her voice soft but edged with a hint of defiance. James stepped closer, settling onto the stone bench across from her, his eyes briefly lingering on the notebook. "What are you reading?" he asked, a trace of curiosity slipping into his tone despite his efforts to mask it. Emily hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line as an internal battle raged. "Just something of mine," she said, her voice evasive, but James wasn't one to let it slide. He tilted his head, his sharp gaze seeming to pierce her defenses. "It looks important to you," he observed. "What's in there that you don't want anyone to know?" His question struck an old wound, sharp and unbidden. Emily shot to her feet, clutching the notebook to her chest, her eyes flashing with defensiveness. "It's none of your business," she snapped, her voice trembling but firm. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by her intensity, but he didn't press. He stood, hands sliding into his pockets, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't mean to pry," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But I want to understand you, Emily. You're not like anyone I've met." His words made her pause. She searched his cold eyes for sincerity, but all she found was the familiar wall he kept around himself. She turned away, heading back toward the mansion, leaving James standing there with an unfamiliar discomfort stirring in his chest. He didn't know why, but that little notebook and her reaction tugged at him in a way he couldn't shake. He needed to know what she was hiding, not just out of curiosity, but because something about her was beginning to challenge his sense of control. The next day, while Emily was out with Sophia preparing for another event, James couldn't resist the pull. He entered the room he'd assigned her, a grand space with white silk curtains and luxurious furnishings. On the small bedside table, beneath a wilted vase of flowers, he found the notebook. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the worn leather, a pang of guilt flickering through him, but curiosity won out. He opened it, and the pages unfolded before him like a portal to another world. Crude sketches of flowers, shaky handwritten lines, and then a page that stopped him cold. It was a drawing of two children holding hands beneath an image of a woman with long hair. Scrawled below in uneven script, "I promise to protect them, no matter the cost." James frowned, his heart beating harder than usual. Who were these children? What did they mean to Emily? He turned the page, finding more fragmented entries. "Mum died when I was 17. I tried, but I wasn't strong enough to keep them with me." A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just a journal. It was Emily's heart, etched in ink and tears. That evening, in the mansion's grand dining room, James couldn't take his eyes off her. She sat across from him, her gaze fixed on her plate, but he noticed the tension in her every movement. Finally, the silence became unbearable. "Do you have any siblings?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable probing. Emily froze, her fork hovering mid-air. She looked up, a fleeting panic flashing in her eyes before she masked it. "Why do you ask?" she countered, her voice quiet but wary. "Just curious," James said, his gaze unflinching. Emily set her fork down, her hands clenching beneath the table, her eyes now brimming with suspicion. "I have two younger brothers," she said at last, her voice trembling. "They live with my aunt somewhere else. I haven't seen them in a long time." James caught the raw pain in her words, a depth of sorrow he hadn't considered before. "You don't keep in touch?" he pressed, his tone gentler, as if stepping into forbidden territory. Emily turned her face toward the window, where the darkness outside swallowed everything. "There's nothing to say," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did what I could, but I wasn't good enough to hold on to them." Her words pierced James, not because he meant to hurt her, but because he realized she carried a burden he'd never imagined. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but her expression stopped him. He knew she wouldn't say another word, not yet. As Emily left the table, climbing the stairs with weary steps, James remained behind, his eyes fixed on her empty chair. He couldn't deny that what he'd read in that notebook had shifted how he saw her. She wasn't just the maid he'd chosen to win a bet. She was a woman who'd fought alone through losses he couldn't fully grasp. And for the first time, a strange respect welled up in him, tinged with guilt for invading her private world. Emily slipped into her room, shutting the door and leaning against it. She pulled the notebook from her pocket, clutching it to her chest as silent tears fell. She knew James had glimpsed something in her tonight, and it terrified her. She didn't want him to know. Didn't want anyone to know, because those memories were hers alone, scars she bore to remind herself to stay strong. But now she felt the walls she'd built beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep them intact against James. The Hawthorne mansion draped itself in a deceptive calm that evening, as if the entire house were holding its breath before an impending storm. Light from the grand crystal chandeliers spilled across the polished wooden floors in shimmering pools, but the air hung heavy, suffocating. James Hawthorne stood by the window, hands buried deep in his pockets, his steely gaze fixed on the pitch-black garden beyond. He'd just returned from a tense meeting, but his mind wasn't there anymore. Lately, Emily Carter, with her unexpected strength and the secrets she guarded, haunted his thoughts, stirring an unfamiliar unease. He wasn't sure he controlled this game anymore. The doorbell's sharp chimes sliced through his reverie. James turned, frowning as the elderly butler's footsteps echoed from the main hall. The door swung open, and Ethan Caldwell strode in, his signature smirk curling his lips, green eyes glinting with mischief. He wore a long dark coat, casually holding a glass of red wine he'd poured himself from the parlor bar. "Evening, James," Ethan said, his voice smooth, but loaded with intent. "Just checking in on your progress. 3 months are almost up, and I'd hate to lose $5 million for nothing." James's lips twitched into a cold smirk, his eyes like ice. "No need to worry," he replied, his tone steady but edged with a subtle warning. "Everything's on track. Emily's done better than you'd expect." Ethan let out a loud laugh, the sound reverberating through the vast space, devoid of warmth. "Better than I'd expect," he echoed, tilting his head as if mulling it over. "She can wear a pretty dress and toss out a few clever lines, but are you sure she's not just a puppet on your strings? Or are you starting to buy into this little play, James?" Ethan's words struck James's pride like a blade. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing, his voice dropping to a growl, like a cornered beast. "What do you want, Ethan? If you're just here to taunt me, you're wasting your time." Ethan shrugged, sipping his wine, his eyes sparkling with delight. "Oh, no," he said. "I just want to clarify something. Does your maid, Mrs. Hawthorne, know this is all a bet? Or are you still letting her think you actually care?" The question hit James like a punch, his heart pounding harder than usual. He'd meant to tell Emily the truth, but every time he met those deep brown eyes, he faltered. He told himself it was strategy, but deep down he knew something else held him back. Before he could respond, soft footsteps descended the stairs. Emily appeared, clad in a simple grey silk dress, her brown hair loose, clutching the small notebook James had seen in the garden. She froze upon spotting Ethan, a flicker of wariness in her eyes. "Hello, Mrs. Hawthorne," Ethan purred, his tone syrupy with mockery. "What a coincidence. I was just telling James about the fascinating story between you two." Emily frowned, stepping off the final stair, her gaze shifting from Ethan to James. "What story?" she asked, her voice quiet but thick with suspicion. James's throat went dry. He moved to intercept Ethan, but it was too late. Ethan tilted his head, his smile stretching into a dangerous curve. "You don't know, Emily," he said, savoring each word. "This marriage is a game. A bet between James and me, $5 million to see if he could turn a maid like you into one of us. And you've done so well. I almost want to lose." His crisp, taunting laugh rang out, a final dagger to Emily's heart. Time seemed to stop. The notebook slipped from Emily's hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud, her eyes wide with shock, her face drained of color as if life itself had fled. She turned to James, and the look in her eyes shifted, not just caution or doubt, but a raw, gaping wound of betrayal. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible. James felt his chest tighten. He stepped forward, reaching for her, but she recoiled, her eyes blazing with pain and fury. "Answer me," she shouted, her voice breaking, the first time he'd seen her unravel. James took a deep breath, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Yes," he said, low and firm. "It started that way. But Emily, listen." She didn't let him finish. "No," she cut in, tears streaming down her cheeks unheeded. "You made me a joke, a trophy to parade before your friends. I trusted you, James. I thought—" Her voice choked, as if words couldn't capture the agony tearing through her. Ethan stood by, his eyes glinting with satisfaction, but James ignored him. He closed the distance, his voice tinged with a desperation he hadn't expected. "Emily, I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his tone trembling for the first time. "What happened after it stopped being a game? I started—" But Emily shook her head, silencing him again. "Don't," she said, her voice small but razor-sharp. "I don't want to hear another lie from you." She bent to retrieve her notebook, clutching it to her chest like a last shield, then turned and fled the room. James called after her, his voice echoing in the hollow space, but she didn't stop. The front door slammed shut behind her, the sound a hammer blow shattering everything between them. Emily stumbled into the night, the cold air biting her skin, but she felt nothing beyond the pain ripping her apart. She dared to hope, even just a little, that James cared, that their moments weren't a sham. Now it was all ashes. James stood frozen in the parlor, his gaze locked on the door she'd vanished through. A strange void yawned in his chest, a sensation he'd never known. He whirled on Ethan, his usual coldness replaced by blazing rage. "Happy now?" he roared, his voice shaking with fury. Ethan shrugged, sipping his wine. "I just wanted clarity," he said, his tone light but provocative. "If you can't handle the heat, don't play, James." James clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms until blood welled, but he didn't lunge at Ethan. He turned away, storming up the stairs, leaving Ethan alone in the parlor. In his study, he slammed the door and leaned against the wall, his breathing ragged. He'd lost her, not because of the bet, but because he'd let her believe she was nothing but a pawn. And for the first time, James felt true regret, a weight money couldn't erase. Outside, Emily walked into the darkness, tears still falling, but she didn't stop. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. Not with someone who'd turned her life into a game. Beneath the faint moonlight, she gripped her notebook, vowing to reclaim herself, even if it cost her a broken heart. After the night the truth unraveled, the Hawthorne mansion sank into a frigid, hollow silence, as if its very soul had been drained. The towering walls, once alive with the echoes of lavish laughter, now bore only oppressive stillness. James Hawthorne stood in his study, his gaze fixed on the expansive window where the dawn painted the garden outside in hues of gold. He hadn't slept since Emily walked away, her fragile silhouette disappearing into the darkness, haunting him like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. For the first time in his life, he felt defeated, not because of the bet with Ethan, but because he'd lost something he hadn't realized he cherished. In the pale morning light, James spotted Emily's small notebook lying alone on the ebony desk, the one she'd dropped in her anguish and hadn't returned to reclaim. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the worn leather cover, a wave of guilt crashing over him. He'd read it, trespassed into the deepest corners of her soul, and now he understood she wasn't just a maid in his game. She was a woman with scars etched into her being, someone who'd sacrificed everything for her family. He gripped the notebook tighter, a new resolve flaring in his eyes. He couldn't let it end like this. That day, James did something he'd never considered before. He refused the wager money from Ethan, ignoring the smug grin and taunting words of his old friend. "Call it your win," he said over the phone, his voice cold but unwavering. "But I don't want your money." Ethan laughed, but James didn't wait for a reply. He hung up, turned to his desk, and embarked on a journey he'd never prepared for. A path to redemption, He sought out a charity Emily had once mentioned in passing, a place that supported struggling families and abandoned children. He recalled how her eyes had briefly lit up when she spoke of it, a fleeting moment of brightness. James wrote a substantial check, but he didn't stop there. He went to the center himself, meeting with the organizers and offering to work on their projects firsthand. Those around him stared in disbelief. James Hawthorne, the man who'd always towered atop the world of power, now in a simple shirt with rolled-up sleeves, laboring alongside them in impoverished neighborhoods. He wasn't doing it for show. He wanted to understand Emily's world, to feel what she'd endured. Meanwhile, Emily found refuge in a small apartment on the city's outskirts, far from the dazzling lights of the Hawthorne estate. The single room had peeling walls and a creaky bed, but to her it was a place to breathe, to heal. She sat by the window, gazing at the narrow street strewn with fallen golden leaves, her notebook resting on the table, unopened. Every glance at it brought James back, his eyes as he tried to explain, his voice calling her name in desperation. She wanted to forget him, to erase those months from her mind, but her heart wouldn't obey. A week passed, and then James found her. He stood at her door, his usual black suit replaced by a plain wool coat, hands in his pockets, his eyes betraying a weariness he couldn't mask. He knocked, each tap resonating like the beat of his heart. When Emily opened the door, she froze, her deep brown eyes widening in shock. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp, a wall she'd built to shield herself. James took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto hers, steady and unyielding. "I came to apologize," he said, his tone low but earnest, "and to return this." He held out her notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it in hers. Emily took it, but her eyes didn't leave his. They flashed with hurt and distrust. "Apologize?" she echoed, her voice quivering. "You think an apology can erase what you did? You turned me into a game, James. You don't get to show up here." James lowered his head, feeling smaller than he ever had. "I know," he said, his voice catching. "I don't expect you to forgive me now, but I need you to know I was wrong. What I felt, it stopped being a game. It was never just that, not after I saw who you are." Emily clutched the notebook tighter, silent tears rolling down her cheeks, unheeded. "You don't get it," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted you. I thought I could lean on you, even just a little. But you shattered everything." James stepped closer, his eyes brimming with a pain he couldn't hide. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can change from now on. I gave up the bet money. I'm working with a charity, the one you said mattered to you. I want to prove I'm not the man you think I am." His words made her pause. She searched his eyes for deceit, but all she saw was a man bearing a vulnerability he'd never shown anyone. "Why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Why do all this now?" James pressed his lips together, his gaze softening as if wrestling for the right words. "Because of you," he said at last. "Because I can't stand the thought of you leaving, thinking you meant nothing to me. You deserve more, Emily." Emily turned away, more tears falling, but she didn't answer. Her heart tore between pain and a faint glimmer of hope she didn't want to acknowledge. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't trust you now. Not after everything." James nodded, his eyes reflecting a pained acceptance. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes, but I won't give up on you, Emily. Not again." He turned and walked away, his figure fading into the sunset's red glow along the narrow street. Emily stood there, clutching her notebook, watching until he vanished. She shut the door, leaning against it, tears still streaming, but a strange feeling stirred within. Not forgiveness, but a small crack in the wall she'd built, where she began to wonder if he might truly have changed. James walked on, the cold air biting his skin, but he felt nothing beyond the burning resolve in his chest. He knew he'd hurt her deeply, but he also knew he couldn't live with her, seeing him as a betrayer forever. He'd prove it, not with words, but with actions. Beneath the fading sun, he vowed this wasn't the end, but a new beginning, a journey to earn back the trust of the woman who'd changed him forever. Time passed like slow drips from a roof after rain, leaving faint streaks on the window of Emily Carter's modest apartment. 2 months had slipped by since she'd left the Hawthorne mansion, escaping James and the glittering world that had swept her up like a storm. Her suburban refuge remained simple: peeling walls, a weathered wooden table by the window where she'd sit and watch the golden leaves blanket the street below. Her worn leather notebook rested quietly on the table, no longer something she shunned, and she'd begun to open it, page by page, facing the memories of her mother, her brothers, and the days she thought she'd lost herself. Yet, despite her efforts to rebuild her life, James Hawthorne lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't erase. Whispers reached her, how he'd forsaken the bet with Ethan, how he was working with the charity she'd once mentioned, how he'd stepped away from the lavish parties of his past. Part of her wanted to believe he'd changed, but the scarred part, the part still raw from his betrayal, wouldn't let her open her heart so easily. She feared that forgiving him would plunge her into another spiral where her heart would break anew. One evening, as the moon hung suspended in the sky, bathing the small garden behind her apartment in silver, Emily decided to step outside for air. She pulled on a long sweater, wrapping her arms around herself against the autumn chill. She walked to an old oak nearby, a sanctuary where she often came to think, to listen to the wind murmur through the leaves. Sitting against its rough trunk, she gazed up at the glowing moon. In that quiet moment, the soft crunch of footsteps on dry grass broke her reverie. She turned, and her heart stuttered as James appeared, standing just a few steps away. He looked different, no tailored suits or the arrogance she once knew. He wore a grey wool coat, his dark hair tousled by the breeze, and those once icy eyes now held a gentleness she'd never seen. In his hands he carried a small bundle of wildflowers, white and simple, tied with a fragile string. "Emily," he said, his voice low and soft, like a plea for permission to enter her world again. Emily shot to her feet, her eyes flashing with a mix of wariness and surprise. "What are you doing here again?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp, a wall rising to guard her fragile heart. James stepped closer, but paused when she edged back. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto hers, unwavering. "I'm here because I can't keep living without telling you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was wrong, Emily. I turned you into part of a game I never should have started. But what I feel now, it's more real than anything I've ever known." He held out the flowers, his hands shaking slightly as he set them at the oak's base. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just need you to know I'm truly sorry." Emily glanced at the flowers, then at him, her heart pounding as if it might break free. She wanted to turn away, to scream that he had no right to stir her again, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. "You think flowers and a few words can fix everything?" she asked, her voice cracking with pain. "You don't get it, James. I trusted you, thought I could rely on you, but you made it all a joke." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, letting them fall as a testament to what she'd endured. James bowed his head, his eyes brimming with a regret he couldn't conceal. "I know," he said, his voice catching. "I can't undo the past, but I've changed myself. I gave up the bet money, worked with that charity you cared about. I didn't do it for show. I did it for you, because you showed me a world I'd never bothered to see." He lifted his gaze, meeting hers, and for the first time she saw raw honesty there. "I love you, Emily," he said, his voice steady yet vulnerable, "and I'll spend my life proving it, if you'll let me." His words hit her like a gust, crumbling the walls she'd built around herself. She turned away, tears falling faster, her heart a storm of longing and fear. She wanted to believe him, to take the hand he offered, but dread clung to her like a shadow. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can trust you again. I'm scared, James. Scared it's just another lie." James closed the distance, and this time she didn't retreat. He sank to his knees before her, taking her hands in his warmth seeping through her cold skin. "I won't promise you the world," he said, his voice soft as a prayer. "But I promise you everything I have, truth, honesty, and time to heal. Let me prove it, Emily. Not with words, but with what I do." He looked up, the moonlight illuminating his face, his eyes alight with hope and pain. Emily stared down at him, her heart torn between old wounds and a flickering new light. She slipped her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself, her gaze lifting to the moon as if seeking answers in its silver glow. Time stretched in silence, filled only by the wind rustling the oak and the breaths of two souls at a crossroads of fate. At last she turned back, her eyes softening, though doubt lingered. "I can't promise I'll forgive you right away," she said, her voice small but firm. "But I'll give you a chance, one chance, James. Don't let me down again." James rose, a gentle smile breaking across his lips, not the arrogant smirk of old, but the smile of a man who'd found light in the dark. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down, I swear." He stepped back, leaving the flowers at the oak's base, then turned and walked away, his figure fading into the moonlit night. But this time he didn't feel weighed down. He felt hope, a sensation he'd never known before her. Emily lingered, watching until he vanished. She bent to pick up the flowers, her fingers brushing the delicate white petals, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She wasn't sure she was ready to fully forgive, but she knew she'd cracked open a door. A door to healing, not just for her, but for them both. Beneath the moon and the oak's shadow, she told herself she'd give him time, and maybe, just maybe, give herself a chance to believe in love again. Time flowed like a quiet river, carrying away the shards of the past and ushering in gentler days. Spring arrived in the city, cloaking everything in tender green and warm breezes laced with the scent of blossoms. The garden behind the Hawthorne mansion, once a stage for challenges, shattered secrets, and departing footsteps, now bloomed under the morning sun. Clusters of delicate white wildflowers swayed beside the ancient oak, a quiet reminder of what had been broken and what had been healed. This was no longer a theatre for power games. It had become a place of new beginnings. Emily Carter stood amid the garden, her fingers brushing the soft petals, her deep brown eyes free of the melancholy they once held. She wore a simple white silk dress, her brown hair dancing in the breeze, and on her lips was a gentle smile she never thought she'd reclaim. After that night beneath the oak, when she gave James one final chance, she hadn't expected him to keep his promise so steadfastly. He didn't just apologize with words, he proved it with actions, day after day, month after month, until the scars in her heart began to fade. James Hawthorne stood nearby, beneath the oak's shade, his eyes following her every move, with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He wore a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up, the arrogance and coldness of his past self gone. He'd changed, not just for Emily, but because he wanted to be a man worthy of her. Over the months, he'd worked tirelessly with the charity, bringing hope to families like the one Emily had once dreamed of saving. He no longer lived to prove anything to Ethan or the elite world. He lived for her, for the love he'd found in the fragments of his own brokenness. Today was special. The garden wasn't just theirs alone. White chairs lined the grass, silk ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and soft laughter rose from a handful of cherished guests. This wasn't a lavish gala with hundreds. It was a small, simple wedding for those who truly mattered. In the front row sat two boys with bright eyes and radiant smiles, beside an older woman. They were Emily's brothers and their aunt, people James had tracked down after tireless effort, reuniting them with her as a wordless gift. Emily turned, her gaze meeting James's, her heart beating faster than usual. She stepped toward him, her hands trembling as she stood before him beneath the oak, where they'd once faced pain and hope. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but brimming with emotion. "You brought them back to me." James smiled, a warmth in his expression she'd never seen before. "I promised you," he replied, his voice low and steady. "And I'll keep that promise for the rest of my life." An elderly officiant with silver hair and a warm voice stepped forward, beginning the ceremony. His words rang through the peaceful space, recounting the story of two souls who'd lost their way but found each other through trials. James took Emily's hand, his palm warm and firm, his eyes never leaving hers for a moment. When it came to the vows, he spoke first, his voice trembling with feeling, but unwavering. "Emily," he said, "I was once a man who lived for power and pride, but you changed me. You showed me what love is, what forgiveness means. I vow to spend my life loving and honoring you, making up for the days I caused you pain." Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. She squeezed his hand, her eyes sparkling in the sunlight. "James," she said, her voice quiet but resolute, "I thought I'd never trust anyone again. But you gave me a reason to believe, to love. I vow to stand by you, not for what you have, but for who you've become." As she finished, soft applause rose from those around them. But for the two of them, the world shrank to just each other. The officiant smiled, declaring them husband and wife. James leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Emily's lips, and she returned it, feeling his warmth spread through her. When they parted, their eyes met, and in that instant the pain of the past melted away, leaving room for a radiant future. Emily's brothers raced over, wrapping her in a tight hug, their laughter ringing like joyful notes through the garden. James watched, gazing at the little family he'd helped her reclaim, and for the first time he felt he belonged. Not to the mansion, not to the elite, but beside her. The ceremony faded into golden sunlight as guests shared stories and slices of cake were passed around. Emily and James sat beneath the oak, hand in hand, watching those around them with a peace they'd never known. She rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes on her brothers playing in the grass. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft as a spring breeze. James turned, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he replied, his voice full of love, "for giving me a chance to do what's right." As the sun dipped, giving way to a golden sunset over the garden, Emily and James stood, walking hand in hand past the wildflowers. No words were needed. They understood this was their true beginning, built on truth, respect, and a love they'd fought for. From a game of arrogance and pain, they'd found life's real meaning. Not power or wealth, but simple moments together beneath the sun and the oak's shade. Night fell, the moon hanging once more in the sky, casting its glow over a garden now alive with laughter and happiness. Emily looked up at James, her eyes twinkling like stars, and he returned a gentle smile. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but together they could face anything. Beneath the moon and the oak, they'd found their true home, not in grand walls, but in each other's hearts. And so James and Emily's story comes to a close. But did their journey touch your heart, from a cold bet to a love that's real? What do you think changed them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If this story moved you, hit that like button to support me and subscribe so you don't miss more emotional tales. What should I tell next? Another secret from James's past or a new character's journey? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for joining me through all 10 parts of this ride. See you in the next video.